The subject this morning is the Defense Intelligence Information Enterprise. This has had a long history. It's about 10 years old now. Some of you might have remembered it in the past as the DCGS, the Distributed Common Ground System Enterprise. It's had a council and a governance process that's worked over the last decade. To the level that we have interoperability between the services on intelligence in the pre-cloud era, this was the primary form in how that was worked. And it certainly provided the initial interoperability that we had after 9/11. It's gone through several instantiations. I mentioned one of them where we evolved from a DCIGS focus. Each of the services have a DCGS program into a larger enterprise that included the combat support agencies and the combatant commands when their joint intel operations centers stood up. And we more recently added coalition enterprises that we'll discuss a little during this presentation. But now we're in a very key strategic phase for the Defense Intel Information Enterprise. We have two major initiatives. You've heard about one, ISITE, and we love ISITE. I was told I had to say that. That you've heard about earlier. There's also the Joint Information Enterprise, which is DoD's counterpart. And both of these are actually more recent than the DI2E Council and its process. And so we've had to adapt to that. And actually we find ourselves in a very strategic role, as you see on the slide. Do we have the slides, first slide? Yeah, there we go. As you see on the slide, that we have to perform a bridging function. And it's a very critical strategic function that I'll describe here in a few minutes. But it actually makes the DI2E Council and its processes and its function within DoD probably more critical than it's been in the past. Next chart. We within USDI have what we call a portfolio, the Battle Space Awareness Portfolio, which is a management construct. It's primarily represented in our programmatic oversight of all the collection platforms and their associated ground systems within DoD. Recently, there's been a major cyber element added. So we have programmatic oversight of those piece parts of intelligence support in DoD. In order to do that function, as you might guess, we have to have a very tight linkage with the intelligence community and OD&I because of the large strategic intelligence that's done by them. And together it makes a single portfolio that we oversee every year. We make programmatic proposals, and in the case of certain parts of it, particularly the defense agencies, we have some direct fiscal control authority over their DoD budgets. One thing that's happened that I'm sure you've heard about is over the last 10 years, whether it's space, airborne, or now cyber, we've increased our intelligence production tremendously by orders of magnitude. And so that input from those collection platforms into their ground processing, analysis, and exploitation, that's gone up tremendously. And so that big arrow in the middle, which represents the DI2E as an enterprise, is a critical function to take all of that and turn it into decision superiority for our warfighters. And what do I mean by decision superiority? It means we have better situational awareness than do our enemies, that we deliver it faster, and probably most important, that it's accessible and decision quality. We can easily overwhelm our end users with so much data that they can't use it for decision advantage. And if you look at the American way of war, it used to be industrial based from World War II. Since the Desert Storm in particularly, we've turned into an information dominant type of warfare. So what we do in intelligence, and particularly in DI2E, I can't overemphasize it, has become a critical part of the American way of fighting wars, whether it's counterterrorism or whether it's conventional operations. Now in the middle, you'll see 4 bars up there that represent the components of the DI2E and are represented on our council and in our governance process. Of course, there's the 4 combat support agencies, well actually 3 of them plus NRO, which is a defense agency of DIA, NGA, NSA, and NRO. They have a unique role and a difficult role because they are clearly part of the Big 5 or the Big 6 within ISITE. and their IT budgets are almost all national intelligence programs, program funded. So that means they respond to Al Tarasic, they respond to Rector Clapper in terms of their IT path forward, and it is driven by eyesight. The rest of the bars in there are DoD funded, largely DoD funded. There's some national intelligence funding within the Joint Intel Ops Centers at the combatant commands, but they're largely DoD funded, and they fall underneath the Joint Information Enterprise and fall underneath DoD programmatic oversight, acquisition, and requirements. And so we have to view them holistically, but in truth, there are two different processes. And we, being in the fortunate position, have to bridge those. I'll say one thing about, of course, we have the DCGS programs, the 4 of them, plus the 1 from Special Operations Command, which is represented here today. And I'll talk about the last bar, BICES-X. That represents actually the coalition piece of the defense intel enterprise, which has become critical, and certainly in the counterterrorism campaigns, and has become vital to all of our theater warfighting plans. BICES originally began as a NATO information, battlefield information exchange system. It's become primarily an intel support architecture, though not exclusively. It certainly within the NATO context has been exercised heavily in Libya and now in the Ukraine crisis. But the important thing with BICES is it's now gone international. It's represented by and executed by a program office that currently is directly tied to OSD. In each of the forward regional commands, there's a BICES program. In the Pacific, it's called APIN, for example. And SOCOM is also very heavily involved in BICES and uses it as a key data interchange medium with our foreign partners. Okay, one last thing I want to make. I talked about decision superiority as being the primary goal of the overall DoD intel enterprise. If you look in the right-hand column and you get down to the bottom, there's something called acquisition support. We are at what I would call a watershed moment where, in addition to decision superiority, we're rapidly moving into an environment where defense intelligence has to support weapon system superiority. The new weapon systems, F-35 is probably the most prominent, but some of the large naval combatants and Army systems, ground systems, are very intel dependent in the sense that they need signatures, they need databases across SIGINT, MASINT, and GEOINT. These are loaded on mission processors that are on board the aircraft or the ship. They're a critical part of detecting and identifying threats at extended ranges, and supporting them requires a tremendous intel effort that, quite frankly, we haven't solved yet. But in the future, I think, certainly from USDI's perspective, we're beginning to view that as a critical adjunct and maybe and eventually a partnership to developing decision superiority as well as supporting weapon system superiority. Okay, next chart. So that's kind of the big picture. As I talked about earlier, we're in a major strategic realignment for DI2E, and that's affected by JIE and eyesight. We operate within the DoD world, and our formal designation is that we're the mission area lead for JIE. That means we're one of the 3 governance processes that do the Joint Information Enterprise within DoD. To that extent, we're subcontracted to Terry Takai and her CIO Executive Council. The other 2 mission areas are the business systems of DoD and the warfighting systems. They have their own separate governance processes, and they all come together at the CIO Council. We have the DI2E Council doing the information mission area, which we in USDI chair, but it is that council that has been subcontracted this governance process for intelligence within JIE. It's not actually USDI, and the council is made up of some of our members here, as well as the Navy and Marine Corps who weren't able to make it today, and the other combat support agencies. So that's our formal role within DoD that we've been designated by Terry Takai and by Dr. Vickers jointly. Next chart. I wanted to talk about our challenge here. If you look at the box on the top, that represents all of our membership. that have been part of the DI2E Council and were part of the DCGS Council that predated it. You have the 4 defense agencies, you have the 10 combatant commands, the service programs, and then the BICES program office. If you look at the Venn diagram at the bottom, that's really our challenge. We have to work that overlap space between those 3 large efforts. ISITE is obviously very intel focused. That's their entire mission space that drives their requirements, but it's also very national focused and working toward those new cloud architectures that have been described before we got here. JIE, on the other hand, has a much larger user base. It has the logistics, the administrative base, the warfighter command and control networks, as well as the defense intel piece. It's a much larger population. Terry Takai is very busy on all those aspects, and so we've been relegated the role of figuring out how to bridge between these Venn diagrams. The red oval on the bottom is, as I mentioned before, working with our coalition partners. I talked about BICES, but it's not strictly restricted to that. It also includes, particularly with our Five Eyes partners, some bilateral relationships on our DCGS programs, which are maturing and in some cases are approaching deployment stages with some of those allies. I'll emphasize once again that we're part of the DoD process, and if you look at those arrows coming from the top box, as I noted before, the arrows that come from the 3 right-hand elements represent DoD authorities and funding. The defense intel agencies, with all their budgets, IT budgets being in the National Intelligence Program, really have to respond to Al-Thoracic and ISITE. But they participate with us, and bridging between them is critical as we go forward. Okay, next. I want to just spend a couple minutes on what DI2E is and is not, particularly in this new world of JIE and ISITE going forward and migrating to cloud-type architectures. It can be very confusing as to where DI2E fits in, particularly for the non-intelligence community. But first and foremost, it's not a competitor with those other programs. Hopefully I've described how we fit within their construct, how we fit within their governance and within their programmatic authorities. And we're the lucky group that really probably has the most challenging problem set to tackle, both technically and organizationally. Our good fortune is we predate JIE and ISITE, so we have about 10 years of experience working with each other, and we've built up some of those networks that hopefully will do us in good stead as we go forward. We are linked to the battle space awareness capability area. As you know, DoD defines everything it does within these capability areas that are defined by the Joint Staff. This is one of the key challenges that we have, and our DCGS programs in particular have, as well as the coalition elements, is that we have to operate at a much lower tactical level than ISITE does. And the network capabilities become a driving factor here. We may not be able to leverage the cloud architectures the way the national community can. In fact, we have to have the ability to operate autonomously in disconnected nodes at the low tactical level. And so that's unique to the DCGS programs and to DI2E in general, and we have to account for that as we go forward. Now you'll hear us refer to something called the DI2E framework, and this is a technical piece of the effort as we go forward, and it's the key enabler that will allow us to technically bridge between what ISITE does and JIE does. And it's a work in progress, I'll be honest about that. It's composed of software services that will enable us to be interoperable. We, with the system engineers of the DCGS programs and CSAs, have defined a set of 183 services that really cover everything we do within defense intelligence information enterprise, from the infrastructure level through the common services into the mission-specific services. So we've defined that trade space. None of our members actually uses it all because they're all tailored toward their individual mission needs and their individual form, fit, and function requirements of whether you're on a ship or on an aircraft or your land unit. However, within that 183 services that we've identified as the entire terrain, there are about 40 that are correlate to 10, what we call 10 focus areas. And the focus areas are things like identity and access management, data tagging, time synchronization. These 10 focus areas and the 40 corresponding functions or services within the overall DI2 enterprise are the key elements of being interoperable between JIE and ISITE, and we have to get those right. And they're evolutionary right now. They're being worked at different levels of maturity and different levels of agreement. We have to be part of the negotiation process between our own CIO, Terry Takai, and Al Tarasic as they define those 10 touch points. They're the ones that we have to converge on and use as a common framework really to be interoperable and do this bridging function. Once that happens, then we believe, I think collectively within the DI2 family, that everything else will be much easier. All the other applications and services that then ride on that common framework will achieve the type of interoperability, and we can collectively achieve the type of efficiencies that we need to. We are not within a DI2 framework definition is what is the real goal of our enterprise and our governance process. We have created a test bed or a clearinghouse element that we've hired NRO. Ed Lane's here from NRO. They both represent their agency on the council, but they also work this clearinghouse function for us. We realize that we have to operate below standards and specs. Standards and specs are absolutely essential, but you have to get down to the implementation details, the reference implementation of the inputs and outputs of each of these software capabilities to really understand what's happening and to achieve interoperability. To obtain a common technical reference for the DI2 Council to make its decisions as we move forward, we've hired NRO to do that, so they will look at each of these capabilities at a technical level, at a reference implementation level. They will do a compatibility testing between JIE and ISITE, and one of the big challenges is those two entities are evolving as well. They're not fixed in stone. They have years, in fact, of evolution, and we have to align with them. But they will do a compatibility test, and they'll ensure that documentation is built to equal standards, and then they will bring that back to the DI Council for decisions on adoption by the individual service programs and by the coalition efforts and BICES. So we do realize we have to be at that technical level, and we have identified resources and an organization to do that. At the end of the day, we are not looking for a one-size-fits-all beyond those 10 focus areas. We recognize that our members have different needs, different mission requirements, and we expect them to have different platforms and be able to operate in different instantiations, particularly as they go to the lower levels. But we want the council to be aware of that, to be aware of it at a technical level, and to provide a forum for getting the highest efficiencies we can. Next chart. I did mention that we operate within the DoD world of requirements and acquisition. We're going through a requirements update of the DCGS ICD, which is the umbrella requirements document for us, and the ConOps that supports it. We're incorporating the cloud architecture migrations that are now underway with JIE and ISITE and incorporating our bridging function. In corresponding to that, we're going to have what we call a family of systems acquisition review and overarching IPT, which is one level beneath the Defense Acquisition Board. And from that, we're anticipating an acquisition decision memorandum that will formalize our strategic tenets for DI2E. And you see on the chart there what are our really top-level strategic tenets. We're approaching this that we will use a federated strategy. We're not going to converge to one cloud architecture. We want to be able to federate between multiple cloud architectures, and we believe that technology allows that if we implement it correctly. We're not going to invent anything if we don't have to. We will use JIE and ISITE standards and concepts and products and architectures when and where we can to leverage them to the most advantageous result. I talked about the clearinghouse that we did before. We can't do this if we operate at too high a level. The devil's in the details, and so we have to have that clearinghouse, that technical adjunct to the council to really guide our paths and our decisions. And as I said before, if we get those 10 focus areas right, then the services can use different platforms, and they can certainly use different applications and services riding on top of those, all being looked at by the DI Council for efficiencies across the different users. Okay, I think I got one more chart, and then we'll get to the real smart people here. This is a team effort. I think I've emphasized that before. One of the interesting things in the DI Council, there's sometimes people have pushed us to say, why don't we just have one big, purple program, large-scale IT program. We've resisted that over the years. We resisted it when we had a DCGS council, and we resist it now. We don't think that that's the best way to do IT modernization. We think what we've set up from a collaborative governance process is the way to go. It's much more commercial-like. We think it'll be more agile. The teamwork and the collaboration has worked. I'd point out, particularly because the Navy's not here, a few years ago, before we got to the cloud architectures, we were using something called the DCGS Integrated Backbone to expose and make data available across the DCGS programs. And I think it was the 1.3 version, I'm not sure. But we asked for all the DCGS programs to come in and show their adoption plan for that, their next software drop. And they all came in, and all of them were within 6 months or within the next year. But Navy was like 2 years to the right. And just through the peer pressure and through their own self-interest, they realized that wasn't really a smart thing to do. We didn't have to move one penny at the OSD level or do any kind of memorandum. The Navy took care of that within the next 2 months, and they were aligned with everyone else because they realized it was to their advantage to get everyone else's data as well as share their own. And there are several other instances over time. Actually, the reduced budgets now are a motivator for this kind of governance process and for us to collaborate and achieve a common framework and then to look at the efficiencies on what rides on that framework. But within this process, I'll emphasize again, the services are the executors. They maintain their own programs. They have to fit it within their own budgets. But we do look at the evolution of those and the timing of when they adopt services that are critical to the JIE and ISITE interoperability. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to each one of our panel members, and they will do, in a very informal fashion, they'll just go through 4 or 5 minutes of their views of their own particular challenges. And first we have Patty Guittard, who is the Deputy CIO of and the Senior Advisor to the Army G2. She's been in this community a long time, and the Army, and I might point out the Army and the Air Force are the 2 largest DCGS programs, and we are fortunate to have both of them here. So over to you, Patty.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, Jim. I guess everybody can hear me. Well, I wish I could see more of you. I can see that first couple of rows, but luckily I've been here since Monday, and I've met a lot of you on the floor space and in other forums for this symposium. So good morning, everybody. I'm really glad to be here. I'm glad Jim invited me to be on this panel, but I'm also very thankful that the Army let us come, right? So we all have our travel challenges, but the Army did think this was important enough to allow me to be here, so thank you, and thank them. As Jim said, I have been with the Army for a considerable amount of years, and DI2E has been part of my portfolio, one of the activities that I've been working for several years. And yes, it does predate ISITE and JIE, so we've had a lot of lively engagement over the last several years with regard to DI2E. So we're very pleased that this particular forum and council and group of defense professionals have taken on the role of bridging this construct between ISITE and JIE. But But I'll say we have this kind of overarching vision from the DoD CIO and the IC CIO of what both of those enterprises are. And we all, we kind of had that statement yesterday, you're either all in or you're all out. Well, we're all in with some caveats, right? We have some other things that we have to achieve, some of which Jim mentioned before. How do we get to our tactical forces? The difference between, our SIPRNet activities, which as DoD members, we're all there on SIPRNet, as well as our IC network. So how do we make all of that work? I'll tell you, because I'm at the GEOINT conference, it's pertinent that Director Long has taken the initiative and the leadership to attempt to have her staff work with the rest of the defense enterprise, not just on ISITE with the IC agencies and with the IC CIO, but with the COCOMs and services and one or two other combat support agencies to help us determine, we used to call this, where do NGA responsibilities end and where do the service responsibilities begin? Even with ISITE and JIE, that question is still a significant question that needs to be answered. So I know we used to call this the line of demarcation. Some of the agencies may be familiar with that term and others not, but I think we've changed the name. I think Director Long isn't a fan of the name line of demarcation, but everybody understands what it means. Where do each responsibilities, and some may overlap, but where are they? And so the Army and all of the services and COCOMs and DIA for sure have been working with NGA to kind of sort through with an ISITE and a JIE background, where are we? What are they going to provide to the services? What are the services' contributions and so forth? So we're working through that. We have great hopes for that strategy. And if that strategy does achieve kind of the level of agreement that we all hope we can get to, then we think it's a possible approach for the rest of the defense enterprise, some of the other agencies. Because frankly, ISITE, providing services to each other, having efficiencies across the agencies, is a wonderful objective. The devil is in the details, and we services, maybe we're the details, right? And the COCOMs. So we look forward to the question and answer period, and thank you again for having us.
Okay, thanks, Patty. Next, we have Bo Marlin, who many of you know. He's the Deputy Director for ISR Programs for Air Force A2.
Thank you, Jim. From an Air Force ISR perspective, our primary equity areas for ISITE are TS-level non-mission services, specifically VoIP and VTC, our Service Intelligence Center, NASIC, and Air Force DCGS mission services and applications. The Air Force has a number of MAGCOMs and agencies, specifically the Air Force Targeting Center, that are non-IC entities and that will need to have access to ISITE services and mission data, and we really can't afford to have any lost patrols out there as we move forward in the migration. Air Force DCGS, unlike perhaps the other services, DCGS is an FOC weapon system, has been since 2008, and so we're in the process of upgrading and sustainment versus developing from scratch, while we're still having to continue to surge to support combat operations, so that's one of our primary challenges. Our Air Force DCG enterprise, just as a background, utilizes 5 core sites, 7 Air National Guard sites, and 6 what we call distributed mission sites worldwide, 1 which is NASIC. The bulk of our Air Force DCGS tasks, 80% or more perhaps, are still focused on GEOINT data conditioning, in other words, metadata tagging, versus just pure ingest or heavy lift analytics. So that's what makes Air Force different a little bit as we handle our GEOINT data. We're still in the process of moving towards, again, a net-centric enterprise solution that leverages cloud technologies, standard hardware, standard software across the enterprise to include the Air National Guard units, and then moving toward virtual processing, virtual analytics, and storage nodes on that network. We're also in the process of drafting a DCGS roadmap for our chief to sign out to chart the way forward for Air Force DCGS. The roadmap's going to emphasize a shift from an agile capability delivery methodology to decrease capability delivery timelines, but also helping to reduce the weapon system sustainment costs. So that's our focus area as we move forward as well. We still have to incorporate QRCs, or quick reaction capabilities, out there for high priority warfighter requirements. In other words, ACES High that we have, which is a hyperspectral capability on our MQ-1 Predators. SIRES 2C, which is a multispectral system on our U-2. High definition on our MQ-9 remotely piloted aircraft. Wide area motion imagery on our MQ-9s, and signals intelligence integration on all of our RPAs. So another challenge is keeping up with all of those quick reaction capabilities while we're also trying to migrate the weapons system to ISITE and JIE. So as opposed to the big five, or perhaps first five, the services in the DOTUS community has to focus on support to worldwide units, CONUS and OCONUS. And as Jim mentioned, the disadvantaged or disconnected users, as well as our heavy compute or heavy volume users like DCGS, GIOX, and the service intel centers. Words do matter, as we found out, and we often use the same terms in this business and mean different things. So I guess we're a community using the same language, but also speaking different languages. So as we say things like cloud technologies and service-oriented architectures, and particularly big data versus large data, I often find myself having to stop people and say, okay, what did you really mean? What is the definition? And I find out we're not speaking the same term. So important that we get the terms correctly as we move along. Speaking of large data objects, if you will, versus big data, the C2S and the GovCloud currently aren't able to accommodate the large data object files from some of our Air Force and some of the other services and agencies' more sophisticated GEOINT sensors. So that leaves another area that we are trying to push forward, as we have a lot of those sophisticated sensors that we need to figure out. Maybe that's the 20% that the community is not providing. ISITE's just beginning to address some of the mission threads versus business and administrative utilities, and there's still much more to explore on our part by the first five before turning to the what we call Agile 12 next. We've got various options for the 80% solution available to us that we need to continue to explore. For instance, C2S, GovCloud, DOTUS Analytic Enterprise, DI2E framework, before a single solution or group of solutions are selected. And we can't afford to make a bad choice in the era of declining budgets, and that we just don't have the funding to do that. So we're really studying that hard as we move forward on a transition plan. So in addition to the requirements of our IC and DoD partners, data sharing and interoperabilities with our Five Eyes partners and broader coalition partners also needs to be addressed in the future. And we're looking at that along with BICES-X, as Jim had mentioned. The declining budgets and manpower, especially in the MIP portfolio, are forcing some difficult decisions for the Air Force as well as others, and are impacting our DCGS modernization and options for the future. Another reason why, as we study this and try to figure out what the transition is, that we get it right the first time. We had an initial Air Force ISITE summit with all the Air Force senior intelligence officers back in beginning of April to begin to develop a transition plan to meet the DNI's direction to transition. We appreciate the outreach and the briefings that the ICCIO's office provided, as well as DIA's analysis and technical directors, to kind of get us to a common baseline, because even within the Air Force and within the SIOs, we find out that everybody has a different idea of what ISITE perhaps is, JIE perhaps is, DI2E. So that provided us a good opportunity to kind of level the bubbles, if you will, as we try to move forward. So now we have a schedule and a timeline to help drive a plan to deliver to the DNI by September for transitioning Air Force DCGS Enterprise to a JIE and ISITE compliant structure. So in a nutshell, that plan is going to involve examining all the potential enterprise and commodity solutions offered by C2S, GovCloud, DOTUS, JIE, and DI2E to adopt and reuse, and emphasize reuse as much as possible, to meet our IT services as well as our requirements in DCGS, and minimize the amount of new development and unique applications that have to be used and developed. So we'll continue to work with the IC Mission Users Group and the DI2E Council to ensure our service-specific requirements are known, and any IC JIE commodity enterprise solutions and services developed for the future are hopefully include our needs. So with that as a backdrop, I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Okay, thanks, Bo. Next is Cruz, who's the Deputy Director for ISR Capabilities and Programs in SOCOM. And as I mentioned before, he represents our one unique DCGS program that's funded out at a combatant command. Right?
Thank you, Mr. Martin, and thank you certainly for the opportunity to speak before all of you today. You know, we believe in the DI2E, GIE, and ISITE philosophy. We realized over the last decade plus of war how interoperable we must be with our service partners and the interagency. In fact, a large portion of the support that we have to our operators is largely intelligence-based. So trying to find a way to migrate into an environment that promotes interoperability is huge for us. However, there's some risk areas and some areas of concern. We had a former commander and a former chief of staff of the Army, Peter Schoonmaker, who used to tell us all the time, don't confuse enthusiasm with capability. It was a very, very important point that we all learned very, very presciently from him. By the way, it also works if you're a father of a teenage kid, so don't forget that, as I'm learning every day. But he also would tell us not to buy the train, but to buy a ticket on the train. So as we're moving forward, we got to be very, very careful that we are very measured in how we make the transitions that we make. Special Operations Command is a joint service organization. It's composed of Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps Special Operations Forces. So on one level, all these services are coming with service common equipment and capabilities. So as we bring them into a joint special operations environment, we must be interoperable. So if you start to consider for a moment now that we are also a functional command, and we work inside of many of the regional combatant commands who have their own architectures, we have to be interoperable with them. And then as we work the seams in between those respective geographic combatant commands, or we enter into a second theater of operation, that represents interoperability challenges as well. And then to further add to the burden of what it is we have to do in special ops is we have to communicate, collaborate, and coordinate with the national intelligence community. Our greatest interagency partners are those big five organizations that are bringing enabling capability and technologies to our backyard. At SOF, we're fairly small in comparison to a lot of folks on the intelligence side. We can't replicate the manpower nor the subject matter expertise of a regional JIAC or a national intelligence agency. So our ability to be transparent and share within that infrastructure, that community, is incredibly important to us. So our vehicle for achieving this interoperability is D6SOF, as Mr. Martin has mentioned. It is a unique architecture that we have built inside of SOCOM for many years that allows us to integrate all of our sensor programs, everything from ground, maritime, and air sensor programs into a cohesive environment that allows us to do the business of special operations. Our SOF information enterprise is our instantiation for the JIE. It is our communications background. It is our cyber weapon system, if you will, for command and control, situational awareness, for collaboration, decision making. So D6OF and the JIE and the SIE have to work hand in glove together. But we've had the luxury of being able to build this within our own environment using our own sources of funding because we do have service-like responsibilities. However, at the national level, when we look at how we're trying to gain efficiencies today because of the contracting environment, the DoD and the national agency are focused on getting efficiencies. That's a little bit different than the approach that we take. We have to take into account the disadvantaged or disconnected user, that SOF ODA that's out there in the foxhole, that Navy SEAL platoon that's out somewhere. And we've got to build an architecture around him or her and start making our way over. So we will never forsake the effectiveness that we must have for the efficiencies that are being gained. So we're trying to approach in a very measured way how we grow from the bottom up and try to apply efficiencies and interoperability and collaboration and standards from the top. So it's a very, very difficult prospect. And I'll leave you with that, and I'll be interested to hear your questions. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Reinier. And last, we have Ed Lane, who's the Deputy Director of the Mission Frameworks Program Office in the Ground Enterprise Directorate of the NRO.
Yes, good morning. Thank you, Jim. Though in the NRO, we have, especially in the Ground Enterprise Directorate, we have a foot clearly in both camps of the JIE camp and in the ISITE camp. On the JIE side, we do the acquisition, responsibilities for the DI2E framework for the department. So in that space, we worked the reference implementation to include all the technical documentation of the services. We work the web service factory, which is what where we would acquire services, right? We don't build any services. We go out to the community. We ask the community to bring services into us that we can then invest in enterprising and documenting for the rest of the community to reuse. We then would do compliance testing against that reference implementation, and then we post the service out to a storefront or a service catalog where it's available for the customers, any customer to take and use, and then we provide customer support. So that's kind of what we do at the DI2E framework level. The process for that is equally compelling and important because we start the process with governance, right? We don't do anything in the DI2E framework space without having it approved by the governing body. And then there's also capability descriptions that are written for each service. So we have, outside of our process, we're governed and we have capability descriptions for the service being written. And then inside of our process is where we would look at take a service in, find the service, take a service in, do the evaluation of that service, make sure that it's fully documented and enterprisable, and then, and again, work in the detailed documentation, putting it into the test, through the test bed and its test scripts, and then putting it to the storefront where it's available for reuse. And not only reuse, but reuse in a way that's interoperable across the community. So our big things in that space are we have to understand not only the source code, but we have to understand how that source code is compiled, and then further, we have to understand how it's configured. Those are all key ingredients to our documentation so that you can have a reusable component that you can take out and reuse out of the storefront. On the eyesight side, you'll hear anybody, if any senior leader you talk to in NRO will say we're all in for eyesight, and I think they take that very seriously. NRO has already restructured to put all of our infrastructure under a single directorate to manage infrastructure, and then we're working to put shared services under a single directorate as well, so that we have a shared service environment. And I think one of the misnomers we get sometimes is that eyesight is about hardware, but it's actually nothing could be further from the truth. Eyesight is really about managing software, right? And we have to, at some point in time, get down to reusable components and then shared services, and we are focusing on that. And then we want applications in the future to be written on a shared service platform against common infrastructure. We are also working very, very diligently to get data into the cloud, right? We're working very diligently to get applications into the cloud. And we're also looking very hard at what's going to take to do the redesign necessary to work in an elastic compute environment, right? Those are all important components. We ultimately want to have the applications separate from the data and the data managed, so that we don't have to deliver end-to-end stovepipes. And the process goes from stovepipes to integrated systems, to componentized systems, to services, to composite services, to web-based services. We are really walking away from the old way of having, systems and integrated systems, and we are really moving over into the web-based services, composite services, and service environment. And so the touch point between JIE and iSight, well, the 10 touch points are one of the ways that we are tied together, but the shared service concept is really the same whether you're in iSight or whether you're in JIE. We don't care where the service comes from. It can be an iSight service, it can come from somebody in the IC community, or it can come from DoD. It doesn't matter. The key is that we can componentize it, document it, and make it available for reuse, and that's our goal. So.
Okay, thanks Ed, and thanks everyone on the panel. I think we'll turn over to Jim to moderate the questions.
All right, thank you. We have what we call in television a hard out, I'm told, at the bottom of the hour, but I think I'm going to seep a little bit into the networking break just so you have a chance to ask some questions. And I might paraphrase a bit just so we can maximize and get everybody, Patricia, Ed, Robert, Reinier, and James, to all be able to comment. So the first one, this is a question from an audience member who said, what are your top 5 challenges? I thought I might just go to each panel member and see if we could ask each one of you what your number 1 challenge is, actionable areas, in the words of the questioner, that you need help with as you go forward. Maybe I can begin with James.
I think we have got in train the top priority for us, which was to get DI2E formalized as an element of JIE and to get the requirements and the acquisition documentation updated. And I think all that's in train. The last 2 pieces aren't completed yet, but the emphasis is on an enterprise level, that we're acknowledged as that JIE functional area lead, and that we are aligning the other parts of OSD to support what we've described that we want to do. So that was our number 1 priority over the last 6 months, and I think we're well along that path. I think underneath that is one of the biggest challenges that you'll probably hear from all the other members here, is that the overall budget environment has put a major box, put us all in a major box. And until we know what we can do using JIE and eyesight elements in this DI framework, and when we can do it, it's very hard to plan, and I know the service programs feel the same way. It's very hard to plan an executable program until you know that at a level of detail that you can rely upon it. And so that uncertainty with low budget environments is probably our biggest challenge.
I'm not surprised that came up. Patricia, can we ask you your number 1 challenge?
Well, I think the number 1 challenge in terms of a transition to eyesight and JIE, I already kind of mentioned, is our conversation with our agency partners to determine what it is they will provide the defense enterprise as compared or related to the non-defense enterprise. So I'm going to leave that one aside and say, beyond that, our number 1 challenge is cost modeling for multiple domains. So if you go in a JIE environment, and the way Department of Defense works that says you're going to pay for the infrastructure as a service, you're going to pay to maintain your applications inside of a defense infrastructure. That's wonderful. But then I turn around to the IC side with the SCI networks, and we end up paying a different set of service providers for a variety of things. And as Jim mentioned, our budget constraints really restrict us in paying 5 different service providers, or 6 different service providers if you include DISA and others. So that is, it's a combination of budgeting and a cost model that puts you kind of renting services from a variety of organizations when your dollars just won't support that.
All right, Robert?
For the priority, as you might expect, our priority continues to be on supporting the warfighter with the DCGS weapon system. So in that context, as I mentioned, we have an FOC weapon system that we're continually having to upgrade in sustainment to address a lot of the quick reaction capabilities that the warfighter needs and continues to need. So again, while we're looking at that, now we have the challenge of how do we start to migrate, transition to eyesight and JIA to be interoperable with all of those and all of the IC and the DoD writ large. Declining budget starts to impact that, does impact that. But overall, we're trying to look at where we need some help, and perhaps policy help, perhaps industry help, is what's the right way to do, to be more agile with acquisition? How do we do that? Because if it takes too long to migrate all of those new QRCs into the weapon baseline or move the weapon baseline, you become irrelevant. So we really need to have a better way to handle and be more responsive to requirements in the acquisition area.
Reinier?
Let me approach that question from a couple of angles. First of all, let me just say, we have acquisition-like authorities and special ops, so we're fortunate in that respect. So we just finished POM 16, which means as we start to implement a lot of this stuff, without knowing with some measure of certainties what the cost models are going to be, the services we know sort of what the services are going to expose, but we don't know what the cost models are going to be. So it's very hard to program and adapt when you've already just finished POM 16 going forward. So that's really important, and it represents a challenge from an acquisition and programming perspective. As we move into this environment of providing infrastructure as a service, paying for data per use, and looking at migrating our legacy applications into an environment, we're going to need help and support programming a lot of those apps. So I think that what the DI is doing with the apps engine and what we're doing in our own storefront is hugely important to us. So that's an area of concern going forward. But at the end of the day, it's really going to come down to that disadvantaged special operator out there in the field who's disconnected, and making sure that we do not break something that works today as we make a migration into this environment world.
Ed, you get the last word.
Okay, super. We, or I in particular, see behavioral or cultural adoption as one of the biggest challenges. We have to look at how we're going to operate in an area where we're sharing services among program offices, where we're adding dependencies to a cloud environment or an infrastructure environment or even a shared service environment. We need industry to buy in and help us to look at being innovative in the area of service development and composite service development, even web service development. And we also have to, take a hard look at our government skill set and our industry skill set. Do we have the right skills available to be able to document services at the level we want to go? So those are some of our challenges is in the behavioral space, in addition to everything else.
Okay, I learned always to follow the clock that gives you more time. So I'm going to follow this one that gives us 9 more minutes beyond the bottom of the hour, so we can get to some more questions. This is one thing that's come up in a number of questions, and it's about complying with the cloud, in effect. This one coming from an audience member: how cloud ready are your software services? And I wonder if that's best directed to you, Ed, or perhaps you, James, to give the broadest answer. Maybe I could give both of you a chance to comment on that. James, if you want to begin.
I think we got a long ways to go. I think that's one of the progress is being made in eyesight clearly, and we're one thing I want to say is we're very tightly linked at the OSD level with Al Tarasic's shop. We're in a process of, he's doing a joint duty assignment that will actually have a member from the DI Council from one of the services, or probably will be a rep over there. I think the Army's making available an 06 position, so we'll have both a military and a civilian rep that will actually live with the eyesight staff on a day-to-day basis. And he's opened up everything, all of his meetings of his own governance process to USDI attendance. But eyesight's been focused on their desktop and on some of their initial cloud stand-ups, but there's still a lot of work to be done. In DI2E, I talked about those 183 services that we're trying to build out that map, and how 40 some of them are critical to the touch points. We've really only done 25. Not all of them, which are, in fact, most of them aren't in the touch point area or the focus point area. So I'm not, as I said before, I'm not the IT expert, so I wouldn't want to give an IT answer, but my sense of the enterprise as a whole is that we're at the crawl stage right now between all 3 efforts, and not much further than that. A lot of work remains to be done.
You want to add something?
Yeah, sure. I would agree. I think in some areas we're ready, and that would be putting development environments in place so that we can do long line development into the cloud. I think we're ready today. I think in other areas where you're going to have large scale services that are written to be used on independent hardware that's delivered with the system, writing those services to work in elastic environments so that we're spinning up and spinning down as we need to in order to keep the cost down. That's an area where we haven't worked. So I agree that there's a lot of work to do there. But in some areas we're ready to move out smartly. In other areas we still have work to do.
Okay. I'm going to put SOCOM on the spot here. Question comes from an audience member. What is an example of cross-agency collaboration where a capability is being shared across SOCOM and a combat support agency like NGA? I wonder if I could ask you.
I think a pretty good example would be our airborne ISR and PED architecture. So a lot of folks don't realize that as the platforms are flying somewhere around the world with a SIG ball or an FMV ball, that the communications infrastructure really is a shared architecture by a lot of folks who are contributing bandwidth or downlinks, et cetera. But then when you take a look at how the process exploitation dissemination is occurring on the back end, It's not only happening inside of SOF here in CONUS, but within NGA, and it's also happening in cases, depending upon if you're first, second, third phase PED, it's actually happening with the agency as well. Does that answer the question?
They'll raise your hand.
All right.
I think it helps. Got part of the way there. We got a few more minutes, and this one is my own curiosity, just how international intelligence sharing works among our international partners. It's something that Jim referred to in his opening speech. You have the case now with Ukraine, complaints from the Ukrainian side that the U.S. wasn't sharing as much intel as they would like. You had John Brennan there possibly to discuss that kind of relationship. And I'll leave it open to the member of the panel who wants to comment on that first, because I know it's a somewhat sensitive topic. But how does that work, particularly for the part? I mean, you got the Five Eyes, that's easy. Then you have our European partners. Then you have folks who are not, for instance, like Ukraine inside NATO, but have shared interests. How do you manage that intelligence sharing relationship? And who'd raise their hand to jump on that?
I'll jump on it a little bit here.
There you go.
So it's a question, whoever asked it, I encourage you to ask Admiral McRaven when he speaks, because he's really on the forefront of changing a lot of national policy in terms of sharing. In the national level, we always talk about Five Eyes, but here at Special Operations Command, we're building an international SOF coordination center that's going to be 37 eyes. So for us, we've been doing sharing with our partner nations SOF for many, many years. So at the tactical level, it's very, very easy. When you start to get host nations involved together at nation state to nation state, it becomes a very problematic process. So BICES is one environment that helps us. We're also looking at capabilities on the unclassified networks that allow us to bring that sort of collaboration to bear as well. Because there's a wealth of data on the open source, in the open source environment that allows for good sharing of good intelligence or information, or whatever you want to call it.
Do you have different gradations among those 37? In other words, I'm kind of picturing concentric circles that certain among that number can be shared, X amount can be shared with them, and you go on from there?
I will tell you that I'm not a foreign disclosure officer expert, but I know it's probably one of the most difficult challenges that particular community has. We have not really entered into that 37I environment the way we're planning it right now, so we're looking at those CONOPS and those TTPs for how we would do that today. I would just say that at the lowest tactical echelon, the sharing occurs very well.
That's good to hear.
One thing I'd like to add to that is that there's certainly an IT element to it and the tools that you need when you set up something like a BICES or a coalition network that has your identity access and management, your multi-level security set up to do that. But one thing in USDI, and it's not really underneath us, it's over in another part that oversees the analytical community, the analysts in terms of how they produce their product, whether they're writing for release, whether they're writing for 37 eyes or writing for 5 eyes, is just as important, if not more so, than the IT network and tools that we set up for working in that multilateral environment.
Okay.
And that has to work, otherwise everything we do is not really going to help.
We got 3 minutes, and I want to give both Robert and Patricia a chance to speak once more before we finish up. This is another one that has come up in a lot of questions, open source, and again, I'm far from an expert, but the question is, what role is open source software playing in CITE and JIE? Does one of you want to comment on that just briefly? Open source, does that have relevance?
It does.
Okay.
Open source, certainly relevance. What we're looking at is, aside from the data that we collect, the GEOINT data, as well as the SIGINT data that we collect on our own, and we go ahead and do the exploitation for that. We need the benefit of the IC and particularly open source to help enrich the data. So as we go forward with our DCGS roadmap, again, we're looking at how do we bring all of those sources in, whether those are, and make those platform and system agnostic, data tag them correctly, bring them all in to be able to enrich the data, and let the analysts, which we're moving to multi-source analysts, then have the benefit of all that data. And a lot of that open source is very, very valuable in terms of pointing, tipping, and queuing toward other activity.
Okay, great. And Patricia, you get the last word. And this is a question on time frame. What is the time frame to have all these systems compliant? Again, systems question, but I think one that's relevant.
Well, I'm probably not one to speak for the ICCIO in that regard. I know there is documentation and there is discussion about FOC dates in, is it 2018, Jim? I'm not sure. But I'll tell you from a service perspective, or an Army, because I can't speak for the other services, I don't think we're going to be ready in 2018 completely. I think we will have made significant progress. And some of the things that we're transitioning, we're kind of putting them on a ready, they're on the runway ready to fly, but we haven't put them in the air yet, to use an Air Force analogy there. But we have made significant progress. What date? I wish I could tell a date. Some of it depends on kind of the agency provisioning, what kind of services. You know, we talk about this a lot. We've talked about ISITE and JIE, and they spend a lot of time on infrastructure. What is the infrastructure as a service going to look like? But the functional applications that will ride that infrastructure are still certainly a work in progress. So we're going to get there. And I want to have one last comment on the open source. So, you know, in IT, we all love the open source idea because it gives us a baseline of commonality. It gives us a start point of interoperability that we don't have to build in. But it's important for the non-IT people out there to understand open source isn't necessarily free. So it's people think they're gaining efficiencies in that regard in terms of cost from open source, and that's not necessarily a true statement.